The Wyoming wind scoured the high desert, whipping dust devils across the alkali flats. Ada Vance stood at the edge of the worn track, her boots cracked, her father's old cavalry canteen a heavy weight on her hip. Before her lay the Tumbleweed Ranch, less a homestead and more a collection of bleached bones weathering under the relentless sky. She didn't know the man inside, only that her feet wouldn't carry her another mile. The walk up the long drive felt like crossing an ocean. Every step kicked up puffs of pale dust that clung to Ada's worn skirt and the frayed hem of her duster. The air smelled of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and something deeper, older, neglect. The ranch house hunched against the wind, its once white paint peeled down to raw gray wood. Shutters hung askew, tapping an irregular, mournful rhythm against the window frames. A rusted weather vane, its rooster long since lost to corrosion, squealed on the barn roof. Beyond, a corral held only dust, its poles sagging. A single, gaunt milk cow lowed plaintively from a lean-to shed. Ada paused at the bottom of the porch steps. 3 warped boards led up to a door that looked like it hadn't seen oil in a decade. Her throat was parched, the canteen's water long gone miles back. She shifted the small canvas-wrapped bundle she carried under her arm. Her mother's cast-iron skillet, the one thing salvaged from the fire. Its familiar, heavy curve against her ribs was the only anchor she had left. She raised a hand, knuckles raw from sun and wind, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness. Silence stretched. Just the wind, the creaking wood, the distant cow. She knocked again, harder, the sound sharp against the desolation. Inside, the scrape of a chair, slow, heavy footsteps. The door groaned inward on protesting hinges. Silas Thorne filled the doorway. He wasn't a tall man, but broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, like an old oak stump. Years etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, grooves carved by sun and something harder, something internal. His beard, more gray than brown, was ragged. He wore faded denim and a shirt that might have been blue once, now the color of dust. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray beneath heavy brows, swept over her without welcome, without hostility. Just assessment. He looked past her, scanning the empty horizon behind her, as if expecting trouble, or perhaps just confirming its absence. Ada met his gaze, forcing herself not to look down. The wind tugged strands of dark hair, long escaped its braid, across her face. She didn't brush them away. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was rough from disuse and dust. She'd asked directions at the last ramshackle stage stop, 10 miles back. Tumbleweed brand. Silas Thorne. Don't expect much. They hadn't lied. He gave a single slow nod. His eyes lingered on the canteen, the worn bundle under her arm, the thinness of her frame beneath the duster. He said nothing. The silence pooled between them, thick as the dust settling on the porch. "Need work," Ada stated. It wasn't a question. Her voice didn't waver, but the effort of speaking the simple words scraped her throat raw. "Room and board. I can do what needs doing." Silas's gaze didn't soften. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, his posture radiating a deep, weary isolation. He scanned the yard again, his eyes skipping over the broken water pump, the tumbleweed caught against the fence, the sagging barn door. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind's whine and the rhythmic tap-tap of the loose shutter. It spoke volumes about the state of the ranch, about the man himself. Ada felt the cold knot of desperation tighten in her stomach. Nowhere else. The image flashed, smoke choking the dawn sky over the little soddy she'd shared with Pa for those few fragile years after Ma died. The crackle of flames, the acrid smell, Pa's cough turning wet and desperate in the choking dark. The frantic scramble out, grabbing only the skillet, heavy and searing hot, before the roof groaned and fell. Then the long empty miles, the charity at settlements already stretched thin, the closed doors, the wary eyes. This place, this silent man, was the end of the road. If he said no, she couldn't let him say no, not without trying. Her hand tightened on the canvas bundle. She took a shallow breath, the air tasting of dust and decay. "I don't talk much, mister." The words felt clumsy, inadequate. She forced them out, her eyes dropping for a second to the skillet's shape beneath the cloth, before lifting back to his impassive face. "But I can cook." Something flickered in Silas Thorne's gray eyes, not warmth, not yet, but a spark of something. Interest, surprise, a faint echo of a need long buried under grief and solitude. His gaze shifted from her face to the bundle she clutched so tightly, then drifted past her shoulder towards the dilapidated cook shack, standing separate from the main house, its door hanging open on one hinge. The chimney stood cold and dark. He didn't move for a long moment. The wind lifted the hem of Ada's skirt, gritty particles stinging her ankles. A magpie landed on the corral fence with a raucous cry, breaking the heavy silence. Silas's jaw worked, a faint grinding sound audible over the wind. He looked back at Ada, really looked at her, the stubborn set of her jaw beneath the exhaustion, the wary hope warring with deep-seated fear in her dark eyes, the way she held the skillet like a shield and an offering combined. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. Just 2 words, but they landed in the dusty silence with the weight of a thrown stone. "You're hired." Relief, sharp and sudden, washed through Ada, leaving her knees momentarily weak. She swallowed hard, nodding once. Silas pushed himself off the doorframe and stepped back, gesturing with a tilt of his head towards the decrepit cook shack. He didn't offer to take her bundle. He didn't smile. He just turned and walked back into the shadowed interior of the house, leaving the door open behind him. Ada stood on the porch for a heartbeat, the wind whipping around her. Hired. It wasn't sanctuary, not yet, but it was a chance. She turned towards the cook shack, its gaping doorway like a dark mouth. As she took the first step off the porch, her boot scuffed against something half buried in the dirt, a glint of metal. She paused, nudging it with her toe. It was a spent rifle cartridge, brass tarnished almost black, common enough out here. Yet, beside it, pressed shallowly into the hard-packed earth, was the clear, sharp imprint of a boot heel, smaller than Silas's heavy work boots, and far, far newer than anything else on this dying ranch. Ada's gaze swept the empty yard again, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling slightly. The wind seemed to carry a new note, faint and cold, beneath its constant moan. Who else had been here so recently, and why? She tucked the question away, tightening her grip on her mother's skillet, and walked towards the shack, the unfamiliar weight of the rancher's silent trust settling uneasily beside the sudden sharp edge of new suspicion. The dust swirled behind her, erasing her footprints almost as soon as she made them. The cook shack wasn't just neglected, it felt entombed. Ada pushed the door wider on its single groaning hinge, stepping into a dimness thick with dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon light, filtering through a grimy window. The air hung stale, heavy with the ghost of old grease, damp rot, and years of abandonment. Cobwebs draped the corners like gray lace, and a thick layer of grit coated every surface. The rough-hewn table, the cold iron stove, the lone shelf holding a few chipped plates and a tin cup. A single, rickety chair lay overturned near the hearth. It smelled less like a kitchen and more like a tomb forgotten by the sun. Ada set her canvas-wrapped bundle carefully on the relatively cleanest patch of table she could find. Unwrapping it felt like a ceremony. The cast-iron skillet emerged, its surface dulled but solid, the familiar weight a grounding presence in the unsettling atmosphere. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, Warm and firm, a clean skillet is the start of every good thing. Ada shows respect for the food and the hands that prepare it. Respect. That's what this place needed. Starting here. She found an ancient brittle broom behind the door and began. Dust billowed in choking clouds as she swept, the rhythmic swish-swish the only sound besides the relentless Wyoming wind sighing around the shack's corners. She righted the chair. She scrubbed the table with a scrap of burlap and precious water hauled from the well. Silas silently pointed her towards a bucket, a rope, a long arduous haul that left her arms trembling. The well water was cold and tasted faintly of minerals and deep earth. She used it sparingly, wiping down surfaces, attacking the worst of the grime on the stove's surface with grim determination. Her movements were methodical, driven by a need to impose order, to carve out a space that didn't feel like it was slowly being reclaimed by the desert. As she worked, her eyes catalogued the remnants of a life interrupted. High on a shelf, half hidden behind a dusty jar, was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint faded to pale ghosts of blue and brown. A child's toy. Ada's breath hitched. She didn't touch it, leaving it in its lonely vigil. Beneath the table, pushed into a corner, sat a sturdy wooden trunk, its latch fastened with a heavy rusted padlock. Secrets locked away. She cleaned around it. The spent cartridge and the boot print lingered in her mind, an itch beneath her skin. After dumping the filthy water outside, she walked slowly towards the barn, her boots crunching on the alkali-crusted earth. Near where she'd seen the print, the ground was harder, less receptive to tracks. But there, leading towards the barn's sagging double doors, was a faint scuff mark, a slight disturbance in the dust that could have been made by a boot dragging, or perhaps something being pulled. She stopped, listening. Only the wind in the barn's eaves, a low, mournful hum. The doors were slightly ajar, revealing only a slice of deeper shadow within. She didn't venture closer, not yet. Back in the shack, the light was fading, painting long distorted shadows. Ada focused on the stove. It took effort to get a fire going. The wood pile was low and damp, the kindling sparse. But finally, a small hesitant flame caught, flickering orange light onto the newly clean stovetop. The warmth was a physical comfort, the first real warmth she'd felt since before. She had little, a small sack of pinto beans given grudgingly at her last stop, a precious wedge of salt pork wrapped in waxed paper deep in her satchel, a handful of coarse cornmeal. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She soaked the beans in water, the only sound the crackle of the fire, and the rhythmic scrape of her knife as she carefully shaved thin slices off the salt pork. The familiar motions soothed her nerves, washing beans, rendering fat in the now gleaming skillet, polished with sand and elbow grease, until it shone like dark obsidian, the sizzle as the pork crisped, releasing a scent that cut through the lingering dust and decay. It was the scent of effort, of survival. She added the beans and water, letting them simmer. While they cooked, she mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of precious salt, patting it into rough cakes. The simple act of preparing food, the focus it required, pushed the gnawing anxiety about the boot print, the locked trunk, the silent rancher, to the edges of her mind. This was a language she understood. This was something she could offer. As dusk deepened, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges visible through the clean window pane, Ada heard the heavy tread on the porch. Silas stood in the doorway, backlit by the fading light, his frame filling the opening. He didn't speak. His gaze swept the shack, the swept floor, the clean table, the firelight dancing on the polished stove, the simmering pot filling the small space with a rich, savory aroma that hadn't graced Tumbleweed brand in years. His eyes lingered for a moment on the skillet, now hanging clean and purposeful on a hook near the stove, then drifted almost imperceptibly towards the high shelf where the wooden horse sat untouched. His expression remained unreadable, carved from the same weathered stone as the land itself, but something in his posture shifted. A fractional loosening of the shoulders, a slight easing of the deep lines around his eyes. He saw the two places set at the scrubbed table. Ada spooned beans and a piece of salt pork onto a plate, adding a golden brown corn cake. She placed it on the table, then stepped back, wiping her hands on her skirt. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on serving her own meager portion. Silas moved slowly, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He sat at the table, the chair creaking in protest. He stared at the plate for a long moment, the steam curling upwards in the lantern light she'd lit. He picked up the fork, the metal looking absurdly small in his large, calloused hand. He took a bite of beans, then another. He broke off a piece of corn cake, ate it. He didn't look up. He didn't make a sound beyond the scrape of the fork on the plate. Ada ate silently, the simple food tasting like sustenance, like a fragile claim staked in this desolate place. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the scrape of forks, the profound unspoken acknowledgement of a shared need being met, however basically. He finished his plate. He didn't ask for seconds, but his eyes flicked briefly towards the pot still simmering gently. Ada refilled his plate without a word. He ate that too, methodically, completely. When he was done, he pushed the plate away slightly. He still hadn't spoken. He looked at her, then at the skillet hanging on the wall. Then finally, his gaze lifted and rested on the small carved wooden horse on the high shelf. His throat worked, a hard swallow. He stood up abruptly, the chair leg scraping harshly. He gave a single stiff nod in her direction, a gesture that might have been thanks, or merely acknowledgement, then turned and walked out into the gathering night, closing the door softly behind him. The warmth of the fire, the lingering scent of beans and cornbread, suddenly felt fragile against the vast cold darkness outside. Ada cleared the plates, the clatter unnaturally loud in the stillness. She banked the fire for the night, the coals glowing like watchful eyes. The lantern cast long, wavering shadows as she prepared for sleep on a thin bedroll laid out on the clean floor near the stove's residual warmth. She lay awake, listening. The wind had picked up again, whistling around the eaves, rattling the loose shutter she hadn't yet fixed. The familiar sounds of the settling shack, the groan of wood, the skitter of a mouse in the walls, were layered with the memory of Silas's silent meal, the weight of his gaze on the toy horse, and underneath it all, the persistent whisper of the boot print, the cartridge, the scuff towards the barn. Just as exhaustion began to pull her under, a new sound sliced through the wind's moan. Not the barn, not the house. Close, a distinct, rhythmic creak, 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 like someone slowly rocking on the porch step of the cook shack itself. Ada froze, her breath catching in her throat. Silas wouldn't rock. He moved with heavy purpose, not that patient, deliberate rhythm. The sound stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and waiting. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, moving away from the shack, fading into the wind-scoured night. Someone had been right outside, listening. Dawn came pale and brittle, frosting the cook shack's single window with intricate, fragile patterns. Ada woke with the memory of the creaking step and retreating footsteps coiled cold in her stomach. The shack, warmed by the banked fire's embers, felt less like a refuge and more like a stage where unseen eyes watched. She rose stiffly, her breath pluming in the chill air, and immediately checked the door. It was latched, just as she'd left it. Peering out the grimy pane, she scanned the porch. The step where the sound had come from looked no different, just weathered gray wood, but in the soft dirt below, hardened by frost now, was a single clear impression, the same smaller, newer boot print she'd seen days before, pressed deep as if someone had lingered, shifting their weight. Listening, she built the fire higher, the crackle and growing warmth a small defiance against the lingering unease. As the frost melted on the window, revealing the stark expanse of the ranch yard, she saw Silas emerge from the main house. He moved with his usual heavy tread towards the barn, but instead of entering, he stopped by the sagging corral fence. He didn't look towards the cook shack. He simply stood, one hand resting on a warped post, his gaze fixed on the distant snow-dusted peaks. The posture wasn't one of work, but of remembrance, or perhaps resignation. The vast emptiness around him seemed to press in, a weight he carried alone. Ada turned back to her domain. Today she had flour, a precious half-sack Silas had wordlessly deposited on the porch step the previous afternoon, along with a small crock of lard. It felt like an offering, a silent investment. She mixed, kneaded, the rhythmic thump of dough against the cleaned table a grounding counterpoint to the silence and the questions crowding her mind. The familiar scent of yeast and flour, warm and promising, began to fill the shack, pushing back the ghosts of neglect. Her father's voice, rough but kind, echoed, "Simple bread, Addie, it ain't fancy, but it fills the hollowness, in man and in place." She shaped the loaves, the memory of their tiny soddy kitchen, the smell of his pipe tobacco mingling with baking bread, a sharp pang of loss before the fire consumed it all. She slid the pans into the oven, the heat radiating a tangible hope. Later, carrying a bucket to the well, she saw Silas wrestling with a broken pump handle near the barn. The metal was rusted, the wood splintered. He heaved, muscles straining against the stubborn mechanism, a low grunt escaping him. Ada set her bucket down. Without a word, she walked over, finding a stout piece of scrap timber nearby. She held it out, positioning it as a lever against the pump housing. Silas paused, his breath clouding in the cold air. He looked from the timber to her face, his gray eyes unreadable, then gave a curt nod. He took the timber, wedged it, and threw his weight against it. Ada braced her smaller frame against the opposite side. Wood groaned, metal shrieked in protest, and then, with a reluctant crack, the handle broke free. Silas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. He looked at the timber in his hand, then at Ada. Not a smile, but a flicker in his eyes. Acknowledgement, perhaps even a sliver of shared effort. He tossed the timber aside and turned back to the pump, his movements now purposeful. He didn't thank her, he didn't need to. The smell of baking bread grew irresistible, a golden promise drifting across the yard. When Silas came in for the noon meal, the shack was warm, fragrant, and two small perfectly browned loaves sat cooling on the table beside a pot of simmering venison stew. Ada had concocted from dried meat and root vegetables. Silas had produced from a cellar she hadn't known existed. He paused in the doorway, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly as he took in the aroma. He sat, and Ada sliced the still warm bread, the crust crackling. She placed a thick slice beside his bowl of stew. He ate slowly, methodically, as always. But when he bit into the bread, a subtle change came over him. He chewed, his gaze distant, fixed on the steam rising from his bowl. He swallowed, then tore off another piece, studying its texture, the golden brown crust. He didn't look at her, but his shoulders seemed to lose a fraction of their permanent tension. He finished the slice, then reached for another, the simple act carrying a weight of unspoken appreciation that filled the silence more than words could have. After he left, Ada tackled the locked trunk beneath the table. Curiosity, and a need to understand the ghosts haunting this place, gnawed at her. She examined the heavy padlock. Rusted, but the latch itself looked sturdy. Using a thin, strong knife from her satchel, her father's skinning knife, another salvaged relic, she carefully probed the mechanism, feeling for weaknesses, her ears straining for Silas's return. It was slow, frustrating work. Just as she was about to give up, feeling the lock's stubborn resistance, the tip of the blade caught on something yielding inside the keyhole. Not metal, cloth. She wiggled the blade, gently teasing. Slowly, painstakingly, she drew out a small, tightly folded scrap of faded calico fabric. Unfolding it revealed intricate, delicate embroidery, tiny blue flowers and green vines along one edge. The rest was torn, as if ripped from a larger garment. A woman's work, a woman's shawl, perhaps. Carefully, reverently, she refolded the fragile scrap and tucked it back into the lock's mouth, leaving it as she found it. The trunk held more than a toy horse. It held echoes of a woman's presence, violently interrupted. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting long skeletal shadows from the barn. Ada, mending a tear in the shack's thin curtain, felt the prickle of unease return. She looked out. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. Later, fetching firewood from the meager pile near the porch, she noticed something near the corner of the shack, partially obscured by a clump of brittle sagebrush. Not a boot print this time. A small shallow hole dug in the loose dirt, about the size of a man's fist, and beside it, half buried, was another spent cartridge. She crouched, brushing away the dirt. It was identical to the first one she'd found. A .44 caliber rimfire. Someone wasn't just passing through. They were watching, marking. But for what purpose? That evening, as Ada washed the supper dishes, she saw Silas not heading straight to the house, but walking slowly towards the cook shack. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his eyes on the step where the mysterious listener had stood. He knelt, running a calloused finger over the wood grain near the edge. He stayed like that for a long moment, head bowed, a stillness about him that felt heavier than grief. Then, silently, he rose, turned, and walked back to the main house without a backward glance. But later, after darkness had swallowed the ranch whole, Ada heard it, the faint rhythmic tap-tap of a hammer coming from the porch. Silas was repairing the step, nailing down the loose board that had betrayed the listener's presence. Ada extinguished the lantern and lay in the darkness near the warm stove. The repaired step was a barrier, a small act of protection. The bread had been a bridge. Yet, the hole in the dirt, the second cartridge, the scrap of embroidered calico, they spoke of a past violence and a present threat coiled tight around the Tumbleweed brand. The wind had died down, leaving an unnerving quiet. She strained her ears, listening beyond the settling shack, beyond the faint sigh of the milk cow in the lean-to. Then, she heard it, not close, from the direction of the barn, a low, guttural sound, choked off almost instantly. Not an animal, a man's voice, thick with pain or fury, stifled, a single harsh word. Mine. Then, silence deeper than before. Ada sat bolt upright in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. Someone was in the barn, and Silas was in the house, unaware. The vast empty night pressed in, no longer just indifferent, but suddenly, terrifyingly occupied. The guttural word, mine, hung in the frozen silence of the cook shack long after the sound itself had ceased. Ada sat rigid in the darkness, the coal's faint glow painting shifting patterns on the wall. Her breath came shallow, every nerve screaming. Barn. Someone in the barn. Silas in the house. The vastness of the Wyoming night, usually a blanket of indifferent stars, now felt like a suffocating shroud concealing menace. She strained, listening until her ears rang, but only the familiar settling sighs of the shack answered. No more voices, No footsteps. Just the oppressive quiet, heavier now, charged with the echo of that single possessive word. Dawn arrived, gray and reluctant, frost etching the window anew. Ada moved through her morning routine, stoking the fire, preparing oats, with mechanical precision, her gaze constantly flicking towards the barn. Its sagging doors seemed darker, more forbidding. When Silas emerged from the main house, his steps were heavier than usual, his face drawn in the pale light. He didn't glance towards the cook shack first, as had become his habit. His eyes went straight to the barn, narrowing, his jaw set in a hard line. He paused, his hand drifting unconsciously to rest on the worn grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. He knew, or at least, he suspected. The night's stillness hadn't deceived him either. He didn't come for breakfast. Ada saw him circling the barn cautiously, studying the ground near the doors, his posture taut as a bowstring. He disappeared inside, the doors groaning shut behind him. The wait was agonizing. Ada busied herself kneading dough for biscuits, the rhythmic thump a poor substitute for the pounding of her heart. Her mother's voice, steady amidst smoke, fears a spice, Ada. Too much ruins the dish. Use just enough to keep your wits sharp. She focused on the dough's texture, the warmth of the fire, anything but the image of Silas, confronting an unknown threat alone in that shadowed space. He emerged nearly an hour later, his expression grimmer than before. He walked directly to the cook shack, the frost crunching loudly under his boots. He stopped just inside the doorway, the cold air swirling around him. His gray eyes met Ada's, holding a question, a shared understanding that bypassed words. He didn't ask if she'd heard, he simply stated, his voice a low rasp, "Tracks, inside, near the old tack room, boots." He paused, his gaze sweeping the warm, fragrant shack, landing briefly on the skillet hanging by the stove. Smaller than mine, the same size as the prints by the shack. He didn't mention the voice. He didn't need to. The confirmation was in the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand flexed at his side. "Barn door," he added after a heavy moment. "South hinge, pulled clean off the post." He turned abruptly and walked back towards the barn, his stride purposeful, an invitation, unspoken. Ada wiped her flowery hands on her apron, her heart hammering, but a thread of resolve, cold and sharp, tightened within her. This was her refuge too now. She followed. The barn interior was a cathedral of dust motes dancing in shafts of weak winter light. It smelled of old hay, dry rot, manure, and something else, a faint, acrid tang of gunpowder. Silas stood by the ruined south door hinge. The thick wooden post was splintered where the hinge pins had been ripped out. A heavy sledgehammer lay discarded nearby, not part of Silas's usual tools. Ada's eyes scanned the chaotic interior, rusted implements, stacked lumber, empty stalls thick with cobwebs. Her gaze snagged on the far stall. The door hung crookedly, and carved into the weathered wood, clear despite the grime, was a single letter. M. Silas saw her looking. He didn't speak, but he walked slowly towards the stall. He stopped before the carved letter, his broad back to her. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep, shuddering breath. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the groove of the M with a tenderness that was startling, heartbreaking. He didn't touch it long. His hand dropped to his side, clenched into a fist. When he turned, his face was a mask, but the grief in his eyes was a raw, open wound. Ada recognized intimately. Martha, Michael, a name lost, a life stolen, the locked trunk, the wooden horse, the scrap of calico. They coalesced around that single silent letter. "Need timber," Silas said, his voice rougher than ever, shattering the heavy silence. He gestured towards a pile of usable planks, stacked against a wall, avoiding her gaze, retreating into practicality. The shared task began. Ada held planks steady, her smaller hands bracing the wood, while Silas, wielding a heavy mallet, salvaged from the chaos, drove new sturdy pegs into the post. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the mallet, striking wood, echoed in the cavernous space, a counterpoint to the unspoken tension. Their movements were synchronized, wordless communication forged by necessity, and the shared weight of the barn's secrets. Silas's shoulder brushed hers as he shifted position. He didn't flinch away. A tiny bridge, built of splintered wood and shared effort. Back in the cook shack later, the comforting ritual of preparing stew, venison, potatoes, carrots simmering in her mother's skillet, grounded Ada. Silas came in at noon. He paused, looking at the steaming pot, the skillet's familiar curve cradling the meal. Then at Ada. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before sitting. They ate in their usual silence, but it felt different, thicker, charged with the morning's discoveries. When Silas finished, he didn't rise immediately. He stared into his empty bowl, then spoke, his voice so low, Ada barely caught it. "My son." He didn't look up. Matthias, 6 years old. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet. Fever took him. Then, his mother, Martha, couldn't stay. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping harshly, and stood. He didn't elaborate on couldn't stay, whether it was grief, the ranch's memories, or something else. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. His gaze flickered towards the high shelf where the small wooden horse stood sentinel. The carving was his. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Ada alone with the echo of names, Matthias, Martha, and the vast aching emptiness they represented. The afternoon bled into evening. Ada, cleaning the skillet with meticulous care, felt the familiar prickle of unease return. Stronger now, she peered out the window towards the barn, its silhouette a dark smudge against the twilight. Nothing moved. Yet, she banked the fire, the warmth a fragile bulwark against the encroaching cold, and the memory of that voice. Later, wrapped in her blanket near the stove's glow, sleep was a distant prospect. The wind had picked up again, whistling around the eaves, rattling the repaired porch step. She listened past the wind, past the settling shack. Then, a sound, not from the barn this time, close, too close. The distinct snick of a boot heel on gravel, just outside the cook shack window. Ada froze, her breath catching. Slowly, silently, she eased herself up, pressing her back against the cold wall beside the window, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She inched her head sideways, just enough to peer through a sliver of the frost-rimed glass. Outside, blurred by the ice crystals, but horrifyingly clear, stood a man, not Silas, leaner, harder, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. He stood facing the cook shack, his head tilted, listening. His hand rested on the butt of a revolver at his hip, and slung across his back, catching the last faint light, was a rifle, its barrel long, cold, and unmistakably ready. He took a slow step closer to the window, his face still shadowed, his intention a silent, chilling threat, hanging in the frozen air. Ada pressed herself flatter against the wall, the cold seeping through her clothes, the skillet hanging just feet away, suddenly feeling like the only solid thing in a world tilting towards violence. He was here, the voice from the barn, the maker of the boot prints, the one who whispered, "Mine," and he was looking right at her refuge. The man outside the cook shack window was a blade etched against the fading light, lean, hungry, eyes like chips of flint in a face shadowed by a battered hat. His hand rested on his revolver, the rifle a stark line across his back. He took another step, peering intently through the frost-rimed glass, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. Ada pressed herself flatter against the cold wall, the rough wood biting through her thin clothes. Her gaze darted to her mother's skillet, hanging heavy and dark by the stove. It wasn't a weapon, not truly, but it was hers. Solid, real. A memory of warmth in a world gone cold and sharp. Before she could move, a deeper shadow fell across the window. Silas. He stood on the porch, a silhouette of implacable stillness between the stranger and the shack door. He held no weapon drawn, but his posture radiated a contained fury, a force as unyielding as the Wyoming bedrock. The wind howled, whipping his coat around his legs, but he didn't flinch. "Evenin', Jedediah." Silas's voice cut through the wind's moan, low and hard as granite. The stranger, Jedediah, jerked his head around, surprise flickering across his harsh features before settling into a sneer. "Silas. Been a while. Place looks 'bout like I expected." His voice was a rasp, the same guttural tone Ada had heard in the barn. "What do you want?" Silas didn't move. Didn't take his eyes off the other man. His hand hovered near his own holstered revolver. Jedediah chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "What's mine, brother? Always was. Martha's share." He gestured vaguely towards the dilapidated ranch buildings. "Paper said half. Pa's will. You just stayed." The word dripped with accusation. "Took it. Buried my sister and her boy, then just took it." "Brother?" Ada's breath hitched. "Martha's brother. Matthias's uncle. Driven not by grief, but by greed and a long festering resentment. The holes dug, the cartridges, markers of claim, intimidation. The whispered mine in the barn, a declaration. Land's worthless," Silas stated, his voice flat. "You know that. Been worthless since the creek dried. Martha knew it. Bat knew it. That's why he gave it to us, not split it." A flicker of raw pain crossed Silas's face. He knew we'd make a life here. Or try. "Worthless?" Jedediah spat into the dirt. Maybe not. But it's owed. Paper says half. I aim to collect, or sell my claim to the first speculator who'll take it." His eyes slid back towards the cook shack window, where Ada knew she was silhouetted against the lantern light. "Heard you hired help. Cook. That her. Looks like she'd fetch a price down at Silverton, save you feeding her." His leer was obscene in the gloom. Silence. Thick. Charged. The wind screamed around the eaves. Then Silas moved. Not for his gun. He took one deliberate step forward, placing himself squarely between Jedediah and the shack door. "You leave." The command was quiet, absolute. "Now. This ain't your place. Never was." Jedediah's hand tightened on his revolver butt. "Or what, Silas? You gonna draw on your wife's kin, over dirt and a hired girl?" Ada couldn't breathe. The image flashed. Her own pa, coughing in the smoke-filled soddy, shoving her towards the door, the skillet thrust into her hands. "Run, Addie. Don't look back." His last act, protection. Her fingers curled, phantom heat from the long-ago fire searing her palms. She wouldn't run. Not this time. This was her ground too. Slowly, silently, she reached up and took the heavy cast-iron skillet down from its hook. Its familiar weight anchored her trembling hands. Outside, Jedediah shifted, his confidence faltering slightly under Silas's unblinking stare and the sheer silent barrier of his presence. "You think you can hold it, Silas? Alone?" He gestured contemptuously at the decaying ranch. "Not alone." The words came from Silas, low and certain. He didn't look back at the shack. He didn't need to. The simple statement hung in the air, a testament stronger than any drawn weapon. It spoke of shared meals, mended hinges, the scent of bread in a place long cold. It spoke of Ada. Jedediah hesitated, his eyes darting from Silas's stony face to the dark window, perhaps sensing the unseen resolve within. The greed warred with a flicker of unease. He was a bully. used to preying on desolation, not confronting this quiet, unified resistance. The wind whipped his coat, emphasizing his isolation. He spat again. "This ain't over, Silas. Paper's still good. I'll be back." He took a step back, then another, his gaze lingering with venomous promise on the cook shack. "Enjoy your help." With a final muttered curse, he turned and melted into the swirling dusk, heading towards a skeletal stand of pines where a ragged horse was likely tethered. Silas didn't move until the sound of Jedediah's retreating footsteps was swallowed by the wind. Only then did his shoulders slump. A fraction, the immense tension bleeding out. He turned slowly towards the cook shack door. Ada unlatched it, stepping out onto the porch, the skillet still held firmly at her side. The cold air bit deep. They stood facing each other in the near darkness, the wind tearing at them. Silas's eyes met hers, searching. He saw the skillet in her hand, understood. A flicker of something profound, gratitude, respect, a shared understanding of the line just defended, passed between them. No words, none were needed. He gave a single curt nod, then turned and walked towards the main house, his stride weary but resolute. Ada watched him go, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her cold and shaky. She looked down at the skillet, its surface cool now, not a weapon, a tool, a promise, like the ranch itself. The next morning dawned brittle and clear, the frost thicker than lace on the window panes. Ada stoked the cook shack fire high, the warmth a tangible defiance against Jedediah's lingering threat and the winter's bite. She mixed batter for flapjacks, the rhythmic sounds a comforting ritual. Later, carrying water from the well, she saw Silas. He wasn't at the barn or the corral. He stood near the main house porch, holding the small, crudely carved wooden horse. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the faded blue paint. Then, instead of placing it back on a high shelf, he carefully tucked it into the pocket of his coat, a small act of reclamation, of keeping Matthias close, not locked away. At noon, Silas came into the cook shack. The flapjacks were golden, stacked high, the smell of hot grease and maple syrup thick in the air. Ada set a plate before him. He looked at it, then at her. His gaze drifted to the skillet, clean and hanging ready. He picked up his fork, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he spoke before eating. "Good," he said, the single word rough but clear, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Smells good." He took a bite. He ate steadily, purposefully, as if fortifying himself not just against the cold, but against the past and the uncertain future. Afterwards, Silas didn't leave immediately. He stood by the stove, warming his hands. His eyes drifted to the locked trunk beneath the table. He hesitated, then knelt. From his pocket, he drew a small rusted key. Ada watched, holding her breath, as he fitted it into the padlock. It clicked open. He didn't lift the lid. He just laid his large calloused hand flat on the worn wood for a moment, a silent conversation with the ghosts within. Then he stood, leaving the trunk unlocked, the key resting beside it. An open door, not a sealed tomb. He walked out, heading towards the barn, perhaps to check on the repaired hinge, perhaps simply to work. Ada cleared the plates. The silence in the shack was different now, not empty, not waiting. It was the quiet of a place breathing again. She walked to the door, looking out. The sun, pale but determined, glinted off the frost. The wind still swept across the alkali flats, but it carried the faint, clean scent of snow from the distant peaks, not just dust. Silas was a dark figure by the barn, examining the post they'd mended together. Ada turned back inside. She took the skillet down, not to wield, but to polish. She rubbed the dark iron with a scrap of cloth and a drop of precious oil, the rhythmic motion smoothing the surface until it caught the firelight, gleaming like a promise kept. She hung it back on its hook, ready. Outside, The Tumbleweed Ranch, weathered and scarred, stood silent under the vast Wyoming sky. It wasn't much, but it was enough, for now, and for whatever wind might blow next.